I just want to thank you all for being here on, I know what is a very, very busy time of the semester. So it's really nice to see you all, and nice to see some folks who have really been involved with the Seizing the Moment project since the beginning, and very, very excited to be able to continue the conversation today. So for those of you that I haven't met, my name is Amber Fletcher. I'm an associate professor of sociology and social studies at the University of Regina. And I am working with Magda Gomans from Community Campus Engage Canada, and also Lynn Gidluck, who is the community director at the Community Engagement and Research Center at the University of Regina. So I'm the academic director of the CERC, and Lynn is the community director of the CERC. And the three of us have been working together on the Seizing the Moment project since early this year. So I know some of you were involved with the big 2-day workshop event that we had in May, and we've also had a series of follow-up conversations that have been happening throughout the year to keep the momentum going. This is the last of those sessions, and this is the one where we really hope to decide on next steps. So to keep that momentum going, but to figure out how we can develop some kind of long-term sustainable project that can build on what we've learned from Seizing the Moment, but also to take it in some important new directions. So that's what the purpose of this conversation is today. We actually would like to spend most of the session hearing from all of you that are here. But before we do that, we thought it would be important to give you a bit of overview summary of what we've learned from Seizing the Moment. So of course, this is coming from the 2-day workshop in May that some of you were able to attend, and also from follow-up workshops that we've had. So I'm going to ask Magda to share the screen, and we'll give you a summary of what we see as some of the key highlights coming out of these very, very rich conversations. And and then what we'd like to do after that is simply turn it over to you folks for basically discussion along 3 different themes. We're hoping this can be a really practical discussion about where we would like to go next with this project. And in particular, we're interested in looking at options for funding it. So looking at a grant proposal is a key part of what we want to do today. So let me first just give a little bit of recap summary of what we've learned from the events so far. First of all, we've, of course, given the post-pandemic transformation focus of these events, these conversations, we've heard a lot about the impacts of the pandemic on community organizations, on community engagement offices, and community engaged researchers as well. So we've had a chance to really connect and communicate with all 3 of those groups, and to hear about some of the challenges that they've encountered with the pandemic. We've heard, probably not surprisingly, about high levels of burnout, uncertainty, reduced funding in the case of community organizations, but also some concerns about precarity for community engagement offices located within universities as well. We've heard about the amplification of vulnerability, those often invisible forms of inequality that have really risen to the surface and become more visible, even though they were always there. During the pandemic, we've seen that sort of magnification of structural inequality, with people experiencing, high levels of alienation or lack of access to essential services. We've also seen the recognition of a need for more spaces to work through these problems together. And as much as there have been challenges with doing our communication primarily or solely online, we've also seen some potential in that as well, in terms of going beyond the limitations of what we can do when we're physically in the same room together. So actually connecting over broader regions and even across the country, as we were able to do with the Seizing the Moment event in May. So we've also heard, and we'll see this in the next section as well, is the importance of building meaningful relationships between community engaged researchers in universities, for example, and particularly with racialized communities, those who again have experienced disproportionate pandemic impacts. So those are the problems that have been identified. We've also identified lots of productive ways forward. So, proactively recognizing some of these challenges, addressing their structural roots. So not just seeing these as kind of individualized or surface level problems. We heard about the importance of building meaningful and respectful relationships, which often embody the values of reconciliation, and especially, again, that the importance of that engagement of racialized communities who have been affected by the pandemic in particularly significant ways. We're looking at the importance of co-governance between community and campus, so kind of equalizing the relationships there and truly working together in a very productive and collaborative way, a way that is adaptive and flexible and hopefully optimistic, and a way that also involves building capacity. So building capacity is one of those key aspects that we're here today to discuss. We want to figure out how can we get hopefully some grant funds, how can we build a really useful project that will meet and address the priorities that have been identified to us by researchers, by community leaders, by community campus engagement actors across the country. And so that's what we're really here today to discuss. We have to date been conducting a literature review. So there have been some probably not surprising themes that have come out of the literature review in terms of, differential impacts of crisis, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's other looming and very current pressing crises like climate change, and the importance of community campus engagement for helping to address some of these problems and potentially mitigate the impacts. So that's where we arrive at in this discussion today. What we've been thinking is to potentially build on what we've learned about pandemic impacts and the sort of crisis, adaptation, transformation focus of the conversation so far, and maybe to build something in anticipation of what we see as a current but also future large-scale challenge, and that is, of course, climate change. So several of us on the research team for Seizing the Moment have expertise. Our own research expertise is in climate change. And given how climate change is so connected to many of the issues we've been hearing about, things like healthcare access and food security and livelihoods and many of these challenges, as well as climate change, of course, exacerbating pre-existing inequalities in the social body, we think that a focus on climate change, and again, going beyond just a problem diagnostic approach, but going into building something perhaps transformative is, we think, is a really good path for, and something that helps to tie together as a really big umbrella approach, many of the things we've been hearing about in these conversations. And of course, we'd like to bring a community campus engagement focus to this. So what can these engagements, what can these relationships do as we face the next big crisis, and one that is being acutely felt right now in many parts of the country and the world? So we imagine that this project would be led by a similar team to what we have done with Seizing the Moment. And of course, many of you are already part of that team, and we're very, very interested in inviting new members to the team, maybe folks that are interested in this but haven't been involved in the management of the project up until now, and to maybe do potentially a series of case studies or demonstration projects that could illustrate the potential, the transformative potential of these kinds of relationships in the context of climate change. So those are just some thoughts that we have, some kind of priorities or interests that we feel we are not only capable of as a team, but also which really address the priorities that we've heard through our conversations. And that brings us to three main questions that we have for all of you today. We do have some background information here on some different grant opportunities, which I'll share with you in just a moment. But the three questions that we have for discussion are: first, what do you think of these admittedly very, very general, very preliminary themes that we've identified for a potential project? Do you feel that they address the community priorities we've been hearing through the project and through your own work as well? Who should be involved and how should they be involved? And then thirdly, which funding opportunities would be a good fit for the project? So on that third question, I'm just going to ask Magda to scroll up back to the opportunities that we've identified. So we've been looking primarily at Tri-Council funding. We have identified the possibility of going for an Insight Development Grant. I'll call it IDG for short, a Partnership Development Grant, PDG, or a Big Partnership Grant. So you can see here in front of you the different amounts that are possible to obtain through these funding opportunities, all of which are SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And you can see there's different durations. So the IDG is the shortest. PDG is almost seen as like a stepping stone to a partnership grant. So one thing we might want to discuss is, if we are interested in a partnership grant as a team, it probably makes sense to go for that partnership development grant first. One of the things we've been discussing amongst ourselves, Magda, Lynn, and I, is while the Insight Development Grant seems to lend itself more so to research, so answering specific research questions, very data collection kind of approach, the Partnership Development Grant and Partnership Grant seem to be more aligned with the very collaborative approach and the many different partners that we have in this project. So we're sort of admittedly leaning toward the PDG as a foundation or a stepping stone for the partnership grant later on. But we would be very eager to hear your thoughts on this. And if you would like to go in a more kind of research-oriented route, maybe the IDG and followed by an Insight grant is the way to go. So that is really the question that we would like to throw out to you is, what should we do? And how would you like to do it? Who would like to be involved? Who's not here that should be involved? And hoping that we can really get your ideas on how you would like to go forward together with this. So at this point, maybe what we can do is we'll stop the screen share. We will copy paste those 3 questions into the chat. And and I'll welcome those of you that I have just joined us during my little spiel there. Thank you very much for those who have joined. And if we could, maybe we could start with the first question, which is basically about the ideas we presented so far, focus on climate change impacts and transformation and the role of community campus engagement in that. But if you'd like to discuss any of the other questions, the floor is open. So you can use your hand up if you'd like. That's probably the best way to go, or you can put your comments in the chat if you prefer, but it would be nice if people want to talk. So over to you.
I just also want to make a note that the document that we just shared, we're going to send a link, share a link to that in the chat if it hasn't already been done. I haven't had a chance to look in the chat. And we encourage you to please add any comments you may have. We consider this a working document. So, either during this hour or, in the days to come, if you'd like to add some comments or additions or, thoughts, please do so.
Thanks, Magda. Yes, Arlene. Hi.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. So this is just me thinking out loud because I haven't, this is sort of we haven't really had time to think about this, but so when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that what you're talking about is how we measure the impact of climate change in ways other than the ecological and environmental ways that we are normally, the narrative we normally use to measure the impacts of climate change. So in my mind, I'm thinking the first step, if we were thinking of taking a data approach to this, would be to develop a new taxonomy that describes impact in a different way that focuses on the social impacts that it sounds like you're interested in trying to measure of climate change. And then there's, deciding on the specific questions that you want to ask. In order to answer those questions, in my mind, the first sort of data step would be trying to map who's in the sector, who's already doing that work. So you have a sense of maybe who's already, and using that new taxonomy, having a sense of who's already maybe trying to answer the questions that you're asking. So you have a sort of a foundational starting point to start a discussion from. So I've been working on mapping the data landscape and the ecosystem across Canada from sort of that technology and this capacity to do that kind of mapping when it comes to the charitable not-for-profit sector, which all of the stakeholders in this would be. So that includes research institutes, universities, and things like that. There might be an easy way and partners that could be easily identified that could, maybe participate in a grant application that could do some of that work.
Mhm.
Just a thought, just thinking out loud.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Arlene. This is exactly what our goal is for today, is really to think out loud together. So I really appreciate that. And I think that the taxonomy, the kind of mapping out idea is something that, because I work in the area of social impacts of climate change, and I think this is something that really needs to be done. So I just want to say I really like your idea and where it's going. Of course, we'd have to, yeah, like I think the community campus engagement piece comes in when you said mapping, like who's already doing the work. So maybe that's kind of an entry point for the CCE piece. Yeah, so thank you very much. And by the way, I realize we haven't probably all met each other, and to avoid taking up too much time doing a big round of introductions, if folks wouldn't mind just kind of introducing yourselves and what organization you're from, the kind of work you do, et cetera, before you speak, that would be wonderful, so we can all get to know each other. And for those of you that have just joined us, I know some folks are just joining, we are discussing the ideas for a potential grant application based on possibly the idea of community campus engagement in the context of climate change. You can read the background document. There's a link to the Google Doc from Betty in the chat. So feel free to go have a look if you haven't yet, and if you missed my little intro spiel. And yeah, we're talking about sort of directions that a possible project could go. So I'll stop talking and see who else would like to share something or comment. Anyone else?
Well, I'll just say, and my apologies for my dog is very loudly barking downstairs. I just wanted to build, on what Arlene said and respond to that, actually. In the discussions that the three of us had, Lynn, Amber, and I, we really talked about how climate change, it's being revealed that it really is everything. So it's touching on all aspects of our lives, social, environmental, etc. And I think that's something that became clear during the pandemic, is really how far-reaching the effects were and how multiple the effects were, and how communities had to work together in many ways, to address challenges that were linked. And we see that parallel in the climate change theme, and something that we can, directly build from in terms of what we've learned about impacts, the interconnectedness of these things, and the potential to address some of these things through communities, perhaps sharing knowledge, working together, that kind of thing.
Thanks, Magda. Susan, you're next.
Hi, everyone. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Susan Meadkiss. I'm Senior Director, Strategic Initiatives and Community Engagement at the University of Calgary, and I'm a proud member of Campus Community Engage Canada. And I also had the great honor of working on the workshops back in May. So I think this is really interesting. And what you've shared has nudged me to think in a deeper way about some of the work that we did explore during Seizing the Moment. And as we see what's happening in BC, and my whole family lives in BC, and there's been a number of phone calls and texts over the last week or so, the climate or weather emergency and tragedy there does touch every aspect of an individual's, a family's, a community's life. Everything from social supports to mental health to working with funding or social service organizations to make sure people can get food on their plate. Livestock, I mean, we've seen the remarkable recoveries of livestock, and it's heartbreaking. So yes, it touches every aspect of a community. And then I think back on the flood in Calgary in 2013, and Magda and I have spoken about this before. Betty's on today's call, and she remembers it well too. The flood provided an urgent need in our community. And I think about my team and the Office of Community Engagement at the time at University of Calgary, and the way we had to really dig deep and explore how to support the community. New partnerships formed and relationships formed, and it did impact partnerships, sponsorships for years to come, the way we worked with the city, the way we worked with emergency services. new research opportunities emerged, and so did experiential learning opportunities for our students. So I think there's some real opportunity with this, this theme area and these questions. I don't have a ton of experience in climate change except for what I've observed or shared and working within a community engagement office during a climate emergency or a weather emergency. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and I think it makes sense. And so if you can continue to build on this, I'd be very interested in supporting the work in whatever way I can. And I do also think the partnership funding opportunity, I can't remember exactly what it's called, the middle one that you've described makes sense.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, the partnership development grant. That's kind of the one we're leaning toward it as well, just because it, you know, I'm sure folks on this call have been involved with partnership, or maybe you've been involved with partnership grants, the big ones, and they are such huge endeavors. We thought maybe a partnership development grant would be a good way to kind of establish something and then hopefully build into something much bigger later. So, so thanks for your comments, Susan. And next we have Christian.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Hambly. I'm the community engagement manager at the University of Ottawa. I joined our team in August, so I was not part of the series of webinars in May, but I talked with Magda, and I was really interested in this vision around climate emergency or climate crisis. So yeah, one thing that I would like to add is that it's interesting to map and see the impact on communities, but also kind of the emerging collaborations between the community, campus, but also student-led movements. So this climate is so important for this generation, and we know why, obviously, but so how we can see and support those emerging relationships, collaborations. So I think that's one point. The other one is we have a small grant program for environmental questions or issues here at the university, and we were discussing with my colleagues this morning how we can envision the next phase, right? So it's not just about, okay, like a community garden, which is really good, really nice, but how we can also see, I mean, climate advocacy and transformative approaches. So, I mean, this is the next phase where we are going, and working together, collaborating on this, and be inspired by many campus and community experiences would be wonderful. So I really support this idea, and also I think the partnership development grant sounds like a good fit. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christian. Yeah, what I'm hearing is a lot of comments that I think align on this idea of looking at what efforts exist and kind of what's being done. And that really fits with the conversations we've been having in the background as well about, like, can we focus in on maybe a few specific case studies of where really excellent community campus engagement on climate or environment is being done, and yeah, and to study those in some way as we build our partnerships. So that's a theme I'm hearing so far, and I just wanted to highlight that. Betty, over to you.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Betty Rice. I'm Communications and Administration with Community Campus Engage Canada. And as we've been talking, I've been thinking about the emphasis that the government is currently putting on climate change. I mean, riding off of the Glasgow Summit and whatnot. And I mean, it's almost like seizing the moment too, because this is a time to work closely with the government to work on this particular area. So I wonder, maybe throwing it back to you, what you know about government funding and where they like to put their investments. Do you have any sort of sense of where the government is going to go with this, so that whatever we do ends up being something that they're very, very interested in and would want to fund? I mean, it seems like a perfect opportunity to find whatever that is and get that funding. So does anybody have any thoughts on sort of the trying to think from the government perspective, what we could give them that they would want to be, so that we could be successful in putting together a program. I mean, do we need to consider that?
Thanks, Betty. That's a good question. Arlene, you have a comment?
I will say that the mandate, because the throne speech just came out, the mandate letters will be out very shortly to the ministers. And so I would say, in light of the recent summit, there's probably going to be some strong language around the government's commitment and mandate that would probably serve us well in a grant application. And the other thing, in the last two throne speeches that this government has had, they have made a commitment to data capacity and infrastructure. So making evidence-based decisions by supporting good data. And so that those two together may serve well as kind of pillars for an ask to be able to identify who those partners are. If you're going to start to form collaborations and partners, that's really the starting point, is identifying who's in the ecosystem.
Yes, thanks, Arlene. I think this is an important question, and I like the idea of potentially citing those priorities that have just been identified in the mandate letters, like that I've made a note here to actually consider how we might integrate those into the application to show how we're responding. So I think that's a really good suggestion. Betty, your hand is up. Do you have another comment, or is it just still up? Okay, it's still up. That happens all the time. Lynn, over to you.
I just wanted to mention that throughout the pandemic, the federal government threw out lots of money to the 211 system, primarily kind of operated through, mostly in most communities, through the United Way. And much of that work has been focusing on data collection and that early identification of kind of the needs of communities. So we might want to involve the United Way and 211 somehow in that, just because of their data collection work, that they worked very hard throughout the pandemic to try to put together some kind of a system at more like each 211 entity operates independently, but they've been trying very hard to put together a national data collection strategy. Because they were really successful in a lot of communities and being able to, because of the calls that came into them, to really predict where the vulnerabilities were.
That's a really good point, Lynn. And so as this is taking shape, at least kind of where my mind is going is, if this is to be a partnership development grant, like the partnership stream, I'm hearing like we would have, maybe we could pursue partnerships with those organizations like the United Way who are doing this work. And then picking up on the previous comment, would it make sense to also pursue possibly partnerships and potentially even in-kind contributions from maybe it's federal departments like Environment and Climate Change Canada, as one example? Like, could we seek out both the nonprofit sector and the government sector, public sector partners? So just a thought. Anyone else? Arlene, is that a hand?
I feel like I'm dominating the conversation.
No, it's great.
I don't want to, but I will say about 211 that government has started to pull back a little bit from 211, and help seeker seems to be the new flavor of the day. But 211 does have the credibility from doing exactly what Lynn just described. So they may be quite a willing partner right now for something like, this kind of a profile of a project. I would imagine this, if it's hitting on what I expect is going to be one of the government's priorities in this next, given the throne speech and this next round of mandate letters, it might be helpful, but help seekers getting a lot of funding and support right now through ESDC. And that's who's funding a lot of the data work is ESDC, but they all require community partners for a lot of the supports that they're giving. So, and there's people that are doing this data work already that, you know, there's no need to reinvent the wheel of how you would collect the data. That's available already.
I'm wondering, Arlene, if you have any details to share about what kind of data is being collected. So is it, you know, impacts primarily? Is it, you know, case studies of partnerships or anything like that?
So it depends on really what you know, what your questions are. So what kind of information you need. So in this case, if you're starting with just trying to figure out who's who kind of thing and who's doing what, it would probably start with meeting with, you know, groups and defining how you describe the work. So what are the key phrases that you would use if you're trying to describe who's doing this work? And then there are data sets, for example, the T3010, which is the income tax return that all charities submit. There's different data sets that can be incorporated that you can use those search words to be able to pull out who across Canada or whatever your geographic focus is, who is doing that work that, you know, crosses with climate change and mental health or whatever it is you've determined are your sort of search fields. And then you can lay over other data sets. So you can then start, you know, adding the not-for-profits, because we know there's probably more not-for-profits than there is charities, which requires separate searches of the provincial registration systems, because there's not a national registration. So, but though that kind of work, that ability, the methodology of it and the technology for it, you know, there's a couple of companies in Canada that are already doing this type of work because they're already trying to answer questions for other sectors that partner with this charitable and not-for-profit sector in Canada. And most of them are researchers, right? They're all research-based questions. And so I just happened to encounter some of these groups because I was doing I was leading the disbursement quota working group, which was looking at a specific policy for government that required trying to figure out how capital flowed in the sector. So that's how I stumbled upon the fact that this is all out there and available and it's happening already. But yeah, so, and I do know that government is, you know, because I sit on the advisory committee for the charitable sector to the Minister of Revenue, I know that this is a priority as far as data and being able to make evidence-based decisions and having organizations from this sector come to government with either an ask to increase their capacity to be making evidence-based decisions where they're able to sort of describe what the return on the investment could be to government, whether it's to advance their mandate or whether it's, you know, whatever their issue is, it's to affect climate change or whatever their other priorities are, and that they're able to, you know, either they're asking to be able to build their capacity to it or they're coming with that work done. So, and asking government to partner in the next steps. So that's, you know, something to think about. All these applications, depending on who they're going to, but if they're going to the government things, it's sort of important to know how they're thinking right now. So that'll change with the next election. But
well, that's great to hear about. I look forward to learning more about that. And it sounds like there's sort of this deep, sort of good foundation in terms of data, you know, in terms of what's going on, in terms of who's being involved across the country to give us that real foundation. And I would also say, you know, some of the things we've been thinking about in this project and potentially making space for is understanding. I know that I've been involved. I was fortunate several years ago to be involved in a partnership grant around community campus engagement, which several of you would have been familiar with, called Community First: Impacts of Community Engagement. And through that process, we really saw the deep value of storytelling as well. So having that foundation of that data that you're speaking about, Arlene, and really getting that firm understanding of, you know, what's going on across the country, and then us thinking about as well, you know, how do we tell the stories of what's going on and what potentially could be, moving forward in terms of adapting to climate change and really getting those individual and community perspectives out there. It'd be interesting to think about how to blend those, that data of what's going on with that sort of storytelling across the country as well.
It's funny, Magda, I was just thinking exactly the same thing. And I was thinking about, it's almost like what we've been discussing so far operates on kind of two levels. So there's like the big, I don't want to say big data because that has a different meaning, but there's like a big breadth focus on in terms of the impacts. So like finding out at a very wide ranging level, very broad level, what those impacts are. But then there's also the agency level. And it seems to me that maybe the agency, what's being done, like some of the, for example, Christian mentioned the student-led movements and like some of these great case studies of what's being done through community campus engagement, that kind of addresses the depth. And so we've got like breadth, impact, and then depth, agency. And I feel like there's two different, like we could use two different methodologies to engage both. So that's just kind of how I'm seeing, but correct me if I'm misinterpreting. Melissa.
Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Johnston, and I've been working with Amber and Lynn and Magda for a while now, and we worked on the grant application for the Seize in the Moment project. And I've also recently been involved in the literature review for this, discussion. And for, I don't know how useful this is, but I'll just tell you some of the things that really popped out while I was doing the literature review that struck me as very interesting and very worth pursuing. One thing was looking at the lessons learned from the pandemic that can be applied to the way we think about climate change. And something that struck me was, in the early days of COVID, there was a real global sense, I think a lot of people would agree, of solidarity, that we were all facing something together, that we were all relatively equally, susceptible to. Since then, obviously, that has broken down, and there's, it's clear that some groups are much more vulnerable than others. Some people are much more buffered from the effects of COVID than others, and that is reflected also in climate change. But what I thought was very interesting was that early feeling of solidarity and urgency and willingness to make dramatic changes and take dramatic action. And that is clearly what is needed in the response to climate change, but there has been much less of that feeling of urgency, despite the fact that the word crisis is now being used. People are much less likely to feel personally that they need to make an urgent change. And so I think thinking about the difference there, maybe exploring what it is that causes, the feeling of urgency and the feeling of willingness to take dramatic action. I think, Susan, you were talking about the urgency felt when your community is impacted by a flood or a fire or whatever it is. You get wide buy-in to making policy changes, to making dramatic changes. And so I think it would be interesting to explore that a little bit. And also another thing that popped out was looking at student movements and student challenges. And, when students are given the opportunity to design their own kind of climate action challenges or games or whatever it is that speaks to them, it's really interesting to see how much action can come out of that. So I think it'd be worth also looking at some of those movements and initiatives among students that get people motivated and get people invested in changing their own personal behavior. And I know there are the sort of parallel conversations about individual actions and behaviors and, higher level policy changes and government level changes. But I'm really interested in understanding the kind of human behavior piece of climate action, and where do those motivations come from? What is it that causes communities and individuals to take action?
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it's one that I think, like, again, I feel like community campus engagement fits into that in so many ways. So I think we can bring this lens to that topic, to that question. Magda.
I was just good. Oh, was there someone else?
Go
Anyway,
ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really like that, those thoughts around urgency, and really thinking about, in terms of what we've thought about as a research team, making sure, and that leads into the next question, I think one of our discussion questions about who should be involved and how, but we've really thought about, the success of the strategy that we used with seizing the moment conversations in, having these regional conversations as well to really highlight diversity across the country, different experiences across the country. And I think having that, having a project that spans across the country, but really looks at individual contexts across the country, perhaps based at different community campus partnerships, different offices, different initiatives, could perhaps really highlight, in terms of that sense of urgency, the subtle effects of climate change as well. In some cases, there's these immediate effects or these, really noticeable effects, but these perhaps subtle, ongoing, growing effects as well. And I think that could really highlight something very interesting.
Thanks, Magda. I think, Sarah, you were interested. Yes.
More of a comment as far as like if you're looking at people who are doing things similar or what's already been done, is in Toronto, there's an organization called Parks People. And they have, I think in the last year or two, they've been growing to be more national. So they're hiring francophones and they're contacting municipalities across Canada to get information about what's happening in their parks, either about homelessness or about environmental climate change. And they're using their academic skills to compile those and create, like you're saying, evidence-based information. And I think it's sort of nice that like they're burgeoning to become national, and you already have the connections with all of the different universities and the wonderful young people who already are passionate about this. So it might be one of those, just looking at what they're already doing, and or maybe a relationship with another NGO who's would be mutually beneficial.
That's a great suggestion. And like, I think we're already well into our second question, which is who should be involved and how. And so I'm kind of hearing it's almost like we've got two different streams going on this question. The first would be who could be potential partners. And so, we've heard about possible government ministries, nonprofit organizations, NGOs. And then there's another stream, which is the possible cases. Like, what can we actually focus in on to collect data, whether it's, like the depth focus, the storytelling perhaps. So that's what I've heard so far, but have I missed anything in terms of who should be involved, and what other ideas do you folks have for who should be involved in this? Any other suggestions? Yeah, Arlene.
I could identify for you the data person that could perhaps once you identify the sources that you want to use for your data, your information, they could probably recommend some additional data sources from their past experience, and then talk about how it could be possible.
That would be great. Can we follow up with you on that by email, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great. I think I'm sure we would have your email address from your registration. Magda, we would be able to contact folks individually, right? Okay, great. Thanks, Arlene. I saw a hand, but I'm not sure who it belonged to. Sorry. Was someone raising their hands? Speak. No? Okay. Oh, yeah, Sarah.
I'm not sure if I'm on the right path, but somebody in academic projects that are often forgotten in these environmental projects, I would say, is people who have boots on the ground, as far as like horticulturalists and the teams at municipalities and things like that, who have observations. So not just the person who sits in the office and has a title, but also those people who have observations from year to year. And yeah, they'd be an interesting group to engage. Don't give them PowerPoints in a room. They probably, an outdoor setting would be best.
Okay, good to know. The idea of having a meeting about something in an outdoor setting, I have to admit, sounds so refreshing. To not have PowerPoint for once. That's great. And I like the idea of municipalities as well, because I think we sometimes, I don't know, sometimes it's easy to think federal and not always about the municipalities. Oh, there's a comment. Oh, thanks, Nadine. Thank you so much for being here. And of course, we'll keep you in the loop as things progress. So we have about 10 minutes left. I feel like we've definitely covered the themes question. I've heard we've got some ideas for who to involve and how. Another comment just came in as well, so we'll note that Climate Action Network Canada as well. And a couple folks have mentioned the partnership stream for funding out of SSHRC, but are there any other suggestions on that third question about where we can get some money to do this amazing work? What do you think? Arlene?
There are private foundations that are interested in trying to map the charitable and not-for-profit sector. So some of them are investing in a subsector level. So there's interest right now in mapping the sports organizations from across the country, for example, and the arts and cultural organizations. So this would be really looking at another subsector. So I'm not a fund development person, but you know, that could be an option. And those types of partnerships generally look for the community-based organization and you know, a credible institution like a research or university.
Yeah, that's great. This is the kind of thing we need to pursue, especially with the partnership stream, is you have to have those in-kind contributions. So maybe bringing in multiple funding partners. Oh, Betty, sorry, over to you.
What about something like the Canadian Federation of Municipalities? I mean, our mayor just had worked with the council, and they've declared a climate crisis, and they're taking steps to take big steps and following along with other cities. I mean, this has been something that has been going on, but Calgary has just taken this step. So maybe they'd be a group that takes it down to at least that civic level, where working with municipalities around the country, I mean, it's all the municipalities, and they get together on a regular basis. They might be somebody to connect with. It's interesting because Magda and I've been working on the membership lists, and I keep seeing the city of Brandon. I don't know if she's assigned me Brandon or whether there are a lot of Brandonites who have joined CCEC, but you know, it seems to me that one of the things I wanted to talk to Magda about was sort of reaching out to some more people at the civic level to get them to be part of the organization. But why not the Federation of Canadian Municipalities as a place to start? I mean, they are a large body, and that might be the kind of place that would allow us that pan-Canadian piece that we're looking for in terms of trying to reach out to different parts of the country to find some of these examples of things that we could do.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. And like, see, a focus on municipalities or inclusion of municipalities seems to make sense given like the impacts of climate change. They're sort of, the municipality is usually the first responder, so to speak, when it comes to climate disasters. So they probably have quite an interest, or I think some would, not all, but yeah, Sarah.
And also often with these partnerships, it's good to like figure out what they can get from you, and having often community engagement in smaller municipalities is not as refined. And often when it comes to things like trees or changing things in parks or where to removing a stream in order to put transit or something like that. Those are often very emotional, contentious issues that sometimes the people are not trained to navigate. The people who are experts in their fields are not trained to navigate. So the things you know about that could benefit them, which would make them more open to share their resources and connections to community. So yeah, my background is in urban planning and horticulture. So this is very interesting.
I figured, yeah, I could definitely tell you have a background in that area. Yeah. And there may be, like, certainly there's got to be some case studies of municipalities that are involved in community engagement activities with researchers, you know, maybe on that theme of environmental management. There's got to be something. Yeah, Susan.
I think there might be some work that's useful through the city of Calgary through the flood, so flood 2013, and also maybe even work done through the Fort Mac fires. And one of the research platforms that UCalgary has that works really closely with the city is called the Urban Alliance. And I think there's other similar platforms at other research intensive institutions across Canada. And so they develop joint projects, collaborative projects to address civic issues, and they bring the researchers and the civic and municipal leaders together.
That might be a good place to focus. Yeah. Arlene.
I'm just thinking that there might be some research that might be useful within some of the stuff coming out of Indigenous organizations right now that would speak to some of that.
Absolutely. Who are often actively involved in climate environment initiatives as well. Yeah. I'm forming a big list here. We only have about 5 minutes left. So is there anything else on any of these 3 questions that folks would like to put on the table? This is truly our like blue sky brainstorm. So yeah.
Yeah, the mill in Pictou County and the First Nations community chief Andrea Paul, that might make a really good case study.
Sorry, Andrea Paul and sorry, I couldn't hear you there.
Chief Andrea Paul and the Pictou Landing First Nations and the Liberal government and the pulp mill. That might make an interesting response to how, you know, municipal governments and provincial governments, all these systems interact around all the different impacts of climate change and when it's destroyed and then when it's restored.
Right. Absolutely. Mindful of the comments here, there's Susan said, Susan had to leave, but she says she agrees with your comments and suggestions, Arlene. So we've got another theme there with engaging with Indigenous leadership and communities. Our numbers are dwindling. I'm mindful that folks probably have to run off to other meetings. So is there any further comment for the moment? Okay, Magdalene, would you like to say anything before we go?
Yeah, I'd just like to let everyone know, just remind them that, you know, we'll send out the link again after this meeting to everyone who's expressed interest, actually everyone who's been involved, I think, and invite them, the link to this document that we presented at the front of this session, and just let them know we do welcome comments. So please add those as you think of them. We certainly are interested in thinking about who we might want to include in this. And, you know, please do feel free to let us know any cautions about any funding paths that we may want to take. It's great for us to think about that now at this stage and everything. So yeah, just saying I welcome further comment.
Great. Lynn, is there anything you'd like to say before we conclude?
No, just thank you, Amber, for being a great facilitator of the conversation today. And on behalf of the team, to thank everybody for joining us. We've had such a great conversation and I'm really excited about the potential of continuing to work with everybody over the course of the next few years, hopefully.
Yeah. Yes, let me add my thanks. Thanks so much to you all for being here and for being interested and for sharing your ideas. And this definitely won't be the last you hear from us. As Magda mentioned, she'll send out a document where we can continue the conversation, and feel free to let us know like how involved you would like to be as we move forward. If there's anyone that's really keen to be, maybe you love writing grants, or you love doing budgets, or, you know, if whatever role you would like to play in this, feel free to get in touch with us, because I hope I speak for all of us when I say the more the merrier. Like, this should be a team effort. This should be a collaboration. And I'm really excited about it. So, so thank you so much. I think we'll conclude there, as it's 1 minute before 1 o'clock, or at least here in Saskatchewan it is. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.